Montana Territory, summer of 1874. The wind carried dust and judgment as the townsfolk of Dry Creek dragged her out of the church by her hair. "She's cursed!" someone hollered. "2 babes born under the same moon! It ain't natural!" another spat. Peony Granger barely felt the rocks cutting into her knees. Her eyes stayed locked on the old preacher's face, but he would not meet her gaze. She wasn't crying. That part of her had burned down the night her babies came into this world, and her husband turned his back on all 3 of them. The twins were only 3 days old when the whispers started. By the 7th day, she'd been driven from town. She clutched the babies now, one against each shoulder, wrapped in fraying quilts. Their names were Prim and Perry, born just minutes apart, both healthy, both perfect. And both the reason she now stood barefoot in front of a mob with torches and spit on their lips. "God'll judge you!" a woman shouted. Peony's chin lifted. "He already did. You are not him." They left her at the edge of the canyon, the sun setting behind her like a gate closing. No food. No water. Just the clothes on her back and the 2 tiny lives in her arms. She walked. Night fell. Coyotes cried in the distance. Her legs were shaking, her skin torn from briars, but she didn't stop. She kept whispering to the babies, kept kissing their warm heads. By dawn, her knees gave out. She collapsed in the open grass beside a shallow stream, her arms wrapped around the twins. "Just a minute," she whispered. "Mama just needs a minute." That was when she heard hooves. A lone rider slowed to a stop just a few feet away. He slid off his horse in one fluid motion, boots crunching dry grass. He was tall, broad across the shoulders. His hat shaded his eyes, but she saw the way he looked at her, cautious, focused. "You alive?" he asked. Peony tried to sit up, but her vision swam. "My babies. I see them." He crouched beside her, his voice low and steady. "You hurt bad?" "Just tired," she breathed. "They need milk." The cowboy nodded. "Name's Abram Zeller. You rest. I'll take care of them." "Do not touch them," she hissed, her voice hoarse. "You take them, I will come back from the grave and drag you straight to hell." He didn't flinch. "I ain't taking them. I'm helping." "You want help, right?" Her lips parted, but no words came. She nodded once. Abram moved fast. He took off his canteen, soaked a strip of clean cloth, and pressed it to her lips. Then he unstrapped his saddlebag and pulled out a tin of goat's milk he'd bought 2 towns back on a whim. "A small bottle, too. I ain't never fed a baby before," he muttered, glancing between the twins. "But I reckon I'll learn right now." Peony watched him, barely conscious, as he cradled the girl first Prim and tilted the bottle. His hands were steady. The baby latched. He let out a breath, surprised. "I'll be damned," he murmured. "You feed the boy too," Peony whispered. "His name's Perry." Abram looked over, and for the first time, their eyes met. Hers were cracked open with pain and raw fear. His were calm, steady, like the earth under her feet. "I got him," he said. He made camp there beside the stream, building a fire with practiced hands. When she woke again, Peony found herself tucked in a bedroll, the twins beside her, warm and breathing soft. Abram sat nearby, carving something into a piece of wood. "You gonna tell me what happened?" he asked without looking up. Peony stared into the fire. "They think I made a deal with the devil. For having 2 at once." He looked up at that. "That's about the dumbest thing I ever heard." She let out a dry laugh. "You ain't from around Dry Creek." "Good thing," he said. "They sound like damn fools." Peony watched him for a long time. He was clean-shaven but rough in every other way, calloused hands, a scar just under his left eye, and a quiet way about him that felt safer than any locked door. "You live nearby?" she asked. "Couple miles west. Got a cabin." "Nothing fancy, but it's dry." "You offering?" "I am." She didn't have the strength to argue. "All right." He helped her up the next morning, gentle as sunrise. She rode in the saddle, weak but upright, while he walked beside the horse, hands on the reins. The twins slept tucked to her chest, and she leaned into the warmth of the big animal under her. The cabin was small, made of pine, with a fenced-in plot and a lean-to for firewood. Abram opened the door and stood back. "You are sure?" she asked. "I do not give shelter to devils," he said. "Just folks who need it." She stepped inside. He gave her the bed. He slept in the barn. Every morning, he brought in water, chopped wood, fed the goats. She tried to help, but her legs gave out more than once. "You got nothing to prove," Abram said, catching her one afternoon as she stumbled near the stove. "I do," she whispered. "To them. To myself." He held her steady. "Then prove it by healing." The days passed. The babies grew stronger. So did she. Sometimes she watched Abram through the window, the way he worked without a word, the way he always checked the door at night, just in case the folks from Dry Creek came looking. One evening, Perry would not stop crying. She tried everything. Abram came in from the barn and reached for the boy. She started. "Just let me try." He held the baby close, bouncing gently, humming some old trail song under his breath. Perry quieted. Peony's eyes filled unbidden. "Thank you," she whispered. He looked over his shoulder, voice soft. "You are not a witch, Peony. You are just a mother who got left behind by cowards." She opened her mouth to reply, but her throat closed. Later that night, she stood on the porch, arms folded against the chill. Abram joined her, leaning against the railing. "I was married," she said quietly. "He left the moment he saw 2 babies instead of 1. Said I brought shame. Said the town would never accept me. He was right." Abram's jaw tightened. "Then he was a fool." Peony looked up at him. "Why are you doing this? You do not know me." "I know enough," he said. "I know strength when I see it. And I know when something worth protecting shows up at my door." Her heart stilled. "You think I am worth protecting?" "I know you are." The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of warmth, of something new and quiet building between them. Peony turned her face toward his. "I am scared." "So am I," he said. "But that does not mean this cannot be good." She stepped closer. He did not move. And when her hand found his, he curled his fingers around hers, strong and sure. No words. Just the fireflies blinking in the night and the slow, steady beat of something beginning. Prim was the first to laugh. It came sudden, one dusky evening while Peony rinsed linens in the basin and Abram whittled a length of birch into a spoon near the hearth. The sound startled them both, a bubbling, weightless thing that made Peony drop the cloth back into the water and turn, hands dripping. Abram set his carving down slowly. "That her?" Peony nodded, transfixed. "She ain't made a sound like that before." The baby kicked her feet, gurgling again like the world had finally offered her something worth singing about. Perry curled beside her, stirred but stayed quiet. "You think she knows she's safe?" Abram asked. Peony didn't answer right away. She crossed to the cradle and ran her fingers over the baby's cheek. "I think maybe she knows I ain't scared anymore." Abram watched her quietly, elbows resting on his knees. "You sure about that?" She glanced at him, but her gaze held steady. "I wasn't sure of anything. Not for a long time. But they eat, they sleep, they laugh. And I'm still standing." He smiled, not wide, just enough for the lines at the corners of his eyes to deepen. "That sounds like sure to me." She went back to the basin, wrung out the cloth, and hung it on the rack. "I've been thinking about the garden," she said after a moment. "The soil out back has a good smell to it. Rich. Dark. If I plant now, I might get turnips before first snow. You tell me what you need. I'll ride into Bridger's Fork. I don't want you buying seed for my sake. I want to." She turned to him, hands on her hips. "Why?" He leaned back again, head tilting just slightly. Because it's your land too now. Peony didn't speak. Her fingers curled against her skirt. She crossed the floor slow until she stood just beside his chair. You didn't ask for any of this, she said softly. You found me half dead in a ditch. And you still kept both babies breathing. She met his eyes. I need to earn my place here. You already did. The silence stretched. Then she knelt beside him, knees to the plank floor, and took his calloused hand in both of hers. I don't want just shelter, she said. I want something that grows. Abram's brow furrowed. You saying you want to stay? I'm saying I want to build. With you. He let out a quiet breath. I'd like that. She leaned forward and pressed her forehead to the back of his hand. He didn't move. Just let her be there, still and close. Later that week, they planted together. She turned the soil with a rusted hoe while he dropped seeds along each groove: mustard greens, carrots, winter squash. Perry slept in a basket under the oak, and Prim kicked at the sky beside him. When the sun got too high, they brought the babies in and cooled them with damp cloths. That night, Peony sat at the table scribbling on a scrap of paper. What's that? Abram asked, washing his hands by the basin. List of names, she said. For the goats. He chuckled. Didn't realize we were naming them. They give milk. They deserve names. He crossed the room and leaned over her shoulder. What did you pick? Mabel. The brown one with the crooked ear. And Ruth for the old one. She's got a stubborn streak. Abram touched the top of her chair. You ever think about leaving? She set her pencil down. I used to. Back when I thought I needed to outrun shame. But I think now I'd rather plant roots. He nodded, then pulled the rocking chair closer to the hearth. She joined him there, the babies already asleep in their shared cradle. They rocked in silence for a while, the night wind brushing the shutters. Peony rested her head on his shoulder. What about you? You ever think about moving on? I did, he said. Before you. He reached for her hand and laced their fingers together. Her breath caught, but she didn't pull away. You reckon folks in Bridger's Fork look at me the same way they did in Dry Creek? She asked. I reckon some might. And you'd still walk beside me? He turned his head toward her. I'd carry you if I had to. She closed her eyes, her hand tightening in his. Then I ain't afraid. They sat like that until the fire burned low, their shadows stretching long across the walls. The night held its breath around them, and for the first time in a long while, Peony felt the weight inside her settle. Not vanish, but settle. Like soil packed around a planted seed. The first frost came early. Not harsh, but enough to silver the tops of the squash vines and turn the breath visible between their mouths when they spoke. Peony wrapped the children tighter in their quilts and began stitching thicker shirts from torn muslin sacks. Abram reinforced the door with a new plank and lined the window seams with wool scraps. One morning, while clearing the chicken coop of ice, Abram lifted a broken egg and frowned. We might need to trade for feed, he said, brushing his fingers on his trousers. The hens are thinning out. Peony looked up from the woodpile she was stacking. Do you trust the folks in Bridger's Fork? I trust the storekeep. Billings. He's fair, keeps to himself. She nodded once. Then take the eggs and what's left of the dried apples. We'll stretch what we've got. He paused. You want me to ride alone? I do. Abram studied her face a moment longer, then gave a small nod. I'll be back by sunset. She watched him saddle the horse and disappear into the trees, a soft ache settling in her chest that surprised her with its weight. She had known men to leave before, but never one who promised to return. With the children sleeping, Peony took the morning to scrub the cabin floor. She moved slow, careful not to wake them, scouring the boards with ash soap and boiling water. When she reached beneath the bed, her hand brushed something hard. Pulling it free, she found a small wooden carving of a bear, its legs worn smooth from handling. She turned it over in her palm. There was a notch carved into the base, as if meant to hold something once, maybe a string, maybe a name. She set it on the shelf above the hearth, beside the tin of matches and the flat river stone Perry liked to grab. That afternoon, the wind picked up. She closed the shutters and lit the lamp early, listening for the sound of hooves. When the baby stirred, she laid them on a wool blanket near the fire and hummed a tune her mother had once used to calm her siblings back in Missouri. "I'm not leaving this time," she whispered, not sure of who she was saying it to. It was well past dusk when Abram returned. His coat was dusted with frost, and he carried a burlap sack over one shoulder. He stepped into the warmth, exhaling hard. "You're late," Peony said, standing. "I walked the horse the last mile." She threw a shoe. She crossed the room and took the sack from him without asking. Inside were a wrapped wedge of cheese, a small tin of molasses, and a paper parcel of oats. "You traded the apples?" "And the eggs. Billings gave me fair weight." She set the sack aside. "You warm yet?" He nodded, tugging off his gloves. "You find the bear?" Her breath caught. "It was yours?" "Made it when I was 15. My sister used to say it looked like a dog, but I told her it was a bear. She kept it on her shelf till she didn't." Peony didn't ask what that meant. She stepped closer and reached for his hands, still red from cold. She rubbed warmth back into them, slow and steady. "I'm glad you came back. I said I would." "I know," she breathed. "But I didn't realize how much it would mean. Until now." He watched her face, silent. Then he leaned forward, and their foreheads touched, the space between them folding in on itself like a tent flap caught in wind. "There's nothing out there for me anymore," he said. "Not since I buried my sister's ribbon behind the ridge. Not since I saw you on that creek, wrapped around those babies like you died before you let the world take them." Peony's throat ached, but she didn't turn away. "I want to stay with you. I want you to." They kissed then, quiet and sure, not rushed, not trembling. Her hands stayed on his chest, his on her waist, the fire crackling behind them. It wasn't just desire. It was the deep, steady knowing that this was the place where the ache ended. Later, they sat on the floor beside the cradle, watching the twins sleep. Peony leaned against his shoulder, her hair brushing his jaw. "I don't want to be someone kept in secret," she said. "I want the world to see me standing beside you." He reached into his coat and pulled out a folded slip of paper. "Then let's make it so." She opened it slowly. A marriage license form, half filled. Her name written in his careful hand. "I didn't want to ask until you were sure," he said. "But I've been sure since the second day. When you told me their names and didn't ask for pity." Peony folded the paper again, held it against her chest. "We'll go into Bridger's Fork. With the babies. Together." "Together," he echoed. Outside, the wind whispered through the pine. Inside, the fire caught, the cradle rocked, and for the first time in her life, Peony Granger knew what it meant to begin again, not as a girl cast out, not as a woman condemned, but as a mother, a wife, and something stronger than either, loved. The ride into Bridger's Fork took most of the morning, the trail winding through cottonwood groves gone yellow at the edges. Abram drove the wagon, reins loose in one hand, while Peony held the twins nestled in a basket lined with wool and dried lavender. The air smelled like riverbank and frost-bitten grass. Neither of them spoke much, but the silence between them had changed, no longer something to fear, but something to rest in. The town appeared over the next rise, modest and square, with a brick mercantile, a smithy, and a chapel with stained glass windows that caught the sun in red and green shards. They passed a man hammering shingles onto a storefront roof and an older woman sweeping her porch with pine straw bundled into a switch. Peony kept her chin lifted. She wore a blue calico dress Abram had traded for 2 weeks prior, and her hair was braided down her back, tied with a strip of linen. She noticed the glances as they passed, some curious, some blank, one or two that lingered too long, but she did not look away. Abram pulled the wagon up beside the store. "Billings'll have the ledger ready," Marriage license too. Peony adjusted the baby's quilts. What do I say if someone asks where I came from? You tell them what you want them to know, Abram said, tying the reins off. The rest's no one's business. Inside, the store smelled of tobacco leaf and apple vinegar. A man with a thin beard and a wide gait stood behind the counter, polishing the glass of a lantern chimney. Morning, Abram said, removing his hat. Zeller. The man nodded. You're here for the form. Abram turned to Peony. This is John Billings. She gave a small nod. Peony Granger. Billings gave a polite tip of his head, then reached under the counter for a folded sheet. You'll need to sign and date. I'll take it to the circuit judge when he rides through next. Peony stepped forward, her hand steady as she wrote her name. Abram signed beneath hers, his letters careful and angled. Once the paper was sealed, they stepped out into the street again. Perry began to fuss, and Peony shifted the basket onto her hip, bouncing gently. Let's walk a minute, she said. They've been still too long. Abram nodded and matched her pace as they headed toward the small square behind the chapel. A man in a wool vest stood with a group of children, pointing at a chalkboard balanced on an old crate. Miss Willis' school's grown, Abram said. Last spring it was just 3 pupils. Peony watched the children recite their sums. I never learned past my letters. You want to? He asked. She looked at him. You think it's too late? I think you've got a sharp mind and a whole life left to use it. She looked down, brushing Perry's cheek with her knuckle. When I was little, I used to imagine learning Latin. Thought if I could write in it, folks might take me serious. Like a scholar. I'll find you a primer, he said. We'll read it together. She turned toward him, her voice quiet. Why do you always believe I can do things I've never done? He didn't hesitate. Because you always do them. Before she could answer, a soft voice called out behind them. Peony? She froze. A young woman stood beneath the chapel awning, her arms full of hymnals. Her hair was pinned tight, her dress pressed, but her face was unmistakable. Clara Renner, Peony said, blinking. I thought you moved to Butte. I did. Clara nodded, stepping forward. But my father took sick, and we came back last winter. Her eyes fell to the babies. She didn't speak. Peony kept her chin high. These are Prim and Perry. Clara's mouth parted, her eyes flicking to Abram, then back to Peony. Folks said you were dead. Not quite. I'm glad, Clara said. Her voice cracked. I'm glad they were wrong. Peony didn't answer. She shifted the basket in her arms and turned slightly toward Abram. Clara stepped back. I should go. As she disappeared into the chapel, Abram touched Peony's elbow. You all right? She used to be my friend. Before. Maybe she still is. She didn't stop them. He didn't answer. He didn't need to. Back at the wagon, Peony settled the babies onto the folded quilts. I want to raise them somewhere they won't be stared at like they're cursed. Then we'll make this place into that. And if we can't, then we'll build another. She looked at him fully then, her voice steady. I want them to grow up knowing what truth feels like. Not just what fear leaves behind. Then they will, he said. Because you're their mother. They rode home in the long light of late afternoon, the mountains catching fire with gold as the shadows stretched across the land. Perry slept with one fist curled beneath his chin. Prim's eyes remained open, fixed on the sky above them. That night Peony tucked the marriage paper into the box beneath the bed, beside her mother's brooch and the letter she never mailed to her sister back east. Abram carved a new cradle rail, smoothing the edge where Perry had begun to chew. They didn't speak much while they worked, but their movements were in rhythm like water drawn from the same well, pulled by different hands, but for the same purpose. Peony watched him from the doorway as he lit the lantern above the hearth, his shoulders backlit, his face lined by the glow. You ever think you'd have this? She asked. He looked over. Not until you. She crossed the room to him. You gave me more than a roof. You gave me more than silence. Outside, the wind had stilled. The goats settled in the lean-to. The babies breathed slow and even in their sleep. Peony reached for Abram's hand, lacing her fingers through his. Let's call this home. He nodded once. It already is. The snow came late that year, in cautious flurries that melted before dusk. Peony stood on the cabin stoop in a shawl thick as bark, watching the sky roll with pearl-gray clouds while Abram repaired the fence where a mule deer had pushed through. Perry was wrapped against her chest, his breath warm through the wool sling. Prim napped inside, a scrap of quilt tucked beneath her chin. She called out, I think we'll have a white December. Abram glanced up, Hammer paused. You worried about the cold? I'm thinking of pies. He grinned, straightened, and dusted his hands. You still got that jar of dried cherries? Might be enough for a small one. She shifted Perry and stepped down. You'd help pit them? I'll help eat it. Later, as she rolled crust on the table with a glass jar, Abram sat nearby shelling walnuts. The children played on a folded blanket, Prim watching her brother with an expression Peony had begun to recognize, a quiet, sharp-eyed patience that mirrored her father's. You ever think of adding on? Peony asked, flour streaked on her wrist. Abram looked up. To the cabin? Room for books. A table with more than 4 chairs. Maybe a loft. He tapped a walnut on the edge of the bowl. We need more lumber. The ridge is thick with pine, but I'd need help cutting it. You think we could get it done by spring? If we start once the snow melts. I can ask around Bridger's Fork. She nodded and lifted the pie plate, setting it on the windowsill to cool. I want this place to grow. You already made it grow, he said. Now we just catch up to it. She smiled, then crossed to the babies, lifting Prim into her arms. She's been watching you all afternoon. I think she likes the way you talk about plans. I talk slow. Maybe she's just surprised I finished my sentences. Peony knelt beside him, the girl balanced against her hip. You ever want more? He blinked. Children? No. Life. Abram set the walnut down. I used to think I'd die before 40. Quiet. In the snow. Not much different than my pa. And now? He looked at her, then down at Prim's tiny hand curled over her mother's shoulder. Now I think I'd like to see what 50 feels like. 70 if I'm lucky. She leaned her head against his. I want that too. The first real snow arrived a week later, tumbling soft into the valley until the fields turned to white and the fence posts disappeared beneath drifts. Abram built a sled from timber scraps and pulled the children through the pasture while Peony laughed from the porch, her breath rising in clouds. At night, they read by lamplight from a borrowed primer. Abram traced the Latin words with his finger while Peony sounded them out, her brows drawn in concentration. A mat, she said one evening. He loves. He looked at her. That's right. She turned the page. Amamis. We love. He reached for her hand. That one's my favorite. By midwinter, they'd begun planning the addition. Abram drew lines on a sheet of butcher paper with a stub of charcoal, measuring with a length of twine. Peony stitched curtains from worn muslin and saved every spare bit of flour for construction biscuits dents, travel-ready rounds to feed whomever came to help raise the beams. In early March, 2 men from town, brothers who owed Abram a favor, arrived with axes and strong backs. They stayed 3 nights, sleeping in the barn and rising with the sun. Peony cooked for them, the children balanced on her hip, while she stirred beans and boiled coffee. On the final afternoon, the last beam was raised. The new room stood square and tall behind the original cabin, rough-hewn but solid. Abram stood beside her, arms crossed over his chest, sawdust in his hair. Looks like it belongs, he said. It does. That night, they moved the beds into the loft, the twins now in their own cradle carved by Abram's hands. Peony lay beside him, her head tucked beneath his chin. You never told me about your mother, she said softly. You speak of your sister, but not her. He was quiet a moment. She died when I was 12. Fever. My sister kept things going best she could. I learned to cook from watching her try not to cry. I'm sorry. I used to think I'd never meet a woman who could hold a family together with her hands alone. She ran her fingers along his ribs. And now? His voice was steady. Now I sleep beside one. In the spring, Peony planted again beans, corn, 2 rows of onions. Abram built a small trellis for squash vines. The goats bore a pair of new kids, and Perry took his first steps in the mud near the well, laughing as he fell into his mother's arms. By summer, the garden flourished. Peony taught herself to write her name in Latin, then taught Abram next. He carved a plaque for the new room, and with her help, etched into it, Domus. Home. On a warm evening in late July, they took the twins walking past the ridge, where the grass grew high and the wind carried the scent of wild plum. They stopped beneath the cottonwoods. Do you miss anything from your old life? She asked. He thought for a moment. Only the quiet. But I found a better kind with you. She touched his cheek. I never thought I'd be loved without being asked to earn it. You earned nothing, he said. You just were. That was enough. She kissed him then, long and sure, her hand in his hair, his arms around her waist. The children sat in the grass, watching bees drift over wildflowers. When the sun dipped behind the ridge, they walked home together, lanterns swinging from Abram's hand, the babies drowsy against their shoulders. The cabin glowed warm against the dark, smoke curling from the chimney, the door wide open to let in the night air. Inside, the cradle waited, the hearth banked, and the future unwinding slow and certain ahead of them. They stepped over the threshold as one husband, wife, children in their arms and love not spoken, but lived.